I was pulling on my jacket, keys already in my hand, when my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. It was my accountant. Daniel. Not a call. A text? All capitals. Stop what you are doing. Do not go to that meeting. Call me right now. I stood there in my hallway, keys dangling, coat half on, staring at those words. Daniel had been my father's accountant for 19 years before he became mine. In all that time, I had never once received a message like that from him. Not when the market dropped. Not when we had a tax audit. Not even when my father died and left me holding everything alone. I called him before I even took my jacket off. He picked up on the first ring. Don't go to that signing, he said. No, hello. No, how are you? Just that. Daniel. What is going on? I have to be at the lawyer's office in 40 minutes. My brother is already. Your brother? He said. And then he paused in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. Is exactly the problem. I need you to come to my office. Right now. I found something in the financials that you need to see before you sign anything. If you walk into that room and put your name on those papers today, you will lose your father's company. All of it. Permanently. I sat down on the bottom stair without meaning to. How long, I asked. How long what? How long has this been happening? Another pause. Longer this time. At least 2 years. He said quietly. Maybe more. Come to my office. Please. I put the keys back on the hook. My father built Callaway Millwork from nothing. 31 years ago, he started with a single workshop in Brantford, Ontario. 2 employees. And a contract with a local hardware chain that he had talked his way into over a cold cup of coffee at a Tim Hortons on Colborne Street. By the time I was old enough to understand what he did for a living, Callaway Millwork had 3 facilities, 64 employees, and contracts with commercial developers across southern Ontario. He never talked about money the way some fathers do, not with pride, not with obsession. He talked about the work, the grain of the wood, getting the measurements right, showing up every single morning and doing the job properly. That was the whole philosophy. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, he lasted 14 months. In that time, he rewrote his will twice, restructured the company's ownership, and had more conversations with Daniel than he had with either of his children. I know this because Daniel told me afterward, and because my brother, I will call him Marcus throughout this. Because that is what I called him for 32 years, before I stopped calling him anything at all, complained about it constantly in the weeks after the funeral. Dad shut me out at the end. He told me, standing in our parents' kitchen while I was still washing dishes from the reception. He went to Daniel for everything instead of his own son. That's not right. I didn't say what I was thinking. I said I was sorry he felt that way. I said Dad loved him. I said grief makes everything feel like a slight. Marcus nodded and looked at the floor, and I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Our father left the company to both of us equally. 50% each. He also left a shareholders agreement that Daniel had helped draft that required both parties to agree before any major decision could be made. Sale of the business. New debt over a certain threshold. Changes to senior management. At the time, I thought this was his way of making us work together, making us need each other. My father believed in that kind of thing. He thought friction produced results. What he didn't anticipate, what none of us anticipated, was that Marcus's wife, Renata, would decide within 6 months of the funeral that the company should be sold. Renata is the kind of person who walks into a room and immediately begins calculating what everything in it is worth. She had never worked a day in the trades. She had an interior design business that I am being charitable when I describe as modestly successful, but she had opinions about Callaway Millwork. And Marcus had always had trouble separating Renata's opinions from his own. By the end of that first year, Marcus was telling me we should sell. Good market conditions. He said. Strategic buyer interest. He said. We're not operators. We're inheritors, he said. And that last one I actually wrote down, because it was so clearly not something Marcus had come up with himself. I said no. I said I wanted to run the company the way Dad ran it. I said I owed that to the 64 people who showed up every morning because our father had shown up every morning before them. Marcus stopped coming to Sunday dinners after that. For the next 18 months, I ran Callaway Millwork and tried not to think too hard about the silence from my brother. We communicated through lawyers when we had to. I made the operational decisions I was permitted to make unilaterally. I hired a new operations manager named Priya, who turned out to be extraordinary. I renewed 3 contracts and brought in a 4th. The company was not just surviving, it was genuinely healthy. And then Marcus called me in September and said he wanted to talk. We met for lunch at a restaurant in Hamilton. He was already seated when I arrived, which was unusual. Marcus had been late to everything his entire life. He looked tired. He asked about my apartment, my cat, whether I was still running. Normal questions. I answered them and waited. He said he had been talking to a company called Norbridge Capital, a private equity group out of Toronto. He said they had approached him 6 months ago, and he had been having conversations, and that they were interested in acquiring Callaway Millwork, and that the number they were discussing was significant. How significant, I asked. He told me. I will be honest. The number was significant. Marcus, I said. I don't want to sell. I know, he said, but I think you should hear them out. 1 meeting. That's all I'm asking. I agreed to 1 meeting. I thought that was reasonable. I thought a 1 meeting concession was the kind of thing that kept a relationship alive without actually changing anything. I did not understand yet what 1 meeting had already set in motion. The meeting with Norbridge was professional and polished, and deeply uncomfortable in ways I could not immediately name. There were 3 of them across the table. Their lead? A man named Fletcher. I did most of the talking. He had clearly been briefed extensively on the company, more extensively, I realized as the meeting went on, than should have been possible, from public information alone. He knew our margins. He knew our 3 largest contracts, by name and renewal date. He knew that we had recently replaced our CNC equipment at the Brantford facility, and what we had paid for it. None of that information was public. All of it was in our internal financial records. I looked at Marcus across the table. He was looking at Fletcher. He had the careful, neutral expression of someone who already knows how a story ends. I said very little for the rest of that meeting. On the way out, I told Marcus I needed to think. He said, "Of course. Take your time. No pressure." Renata texted me that evening to say she hoped the meeting went well and that she was so excited about what this could mean for our family. I forwarded that text to Daniel and asked him to pull everything he could on Norbridge Capital. That was in late September. 6 weeks later, he called me at 7 a.m. and said, "You need to come in." I found it. I sat across from Daniel in his office on a Tuesday, a coffee going cold beside me. While he walked me through what he had found, it started with a discrepancy, small enough that it might have been a rounding error or a data entry mistake if it appeared once. But Daniel had found versions of it in 11 separate places across 2 years of internal financial records, records that Marcus had access to as a co-owner, records that existed on a shared drive that both of us could technically access. Someone had been systematically altering our revenue figures in the internal records. Not the official filings, those were clean, because they had to pass external audit. But the internal operational documents, the ones that informed our strategic planning and that I relied on when making decisions about expansion or capital investment, those had been quietly, carefully manipulated downward. Someone made the company look less profitable than it actually is. Daniel said, "From the inside, over an extended period of time." Why, I asked? Though I already knew, because Norbridge Capital's offer is based on an EBITDA multiple. He said, "If you suppress the internal figures over time, you create a paper trail that suggests the company is worth less than it is. A sophisticated buyer would want to do their own due diligence. But if the seller's own records support the lower number, the seller," I said. Marcus. Daniel looked at me. The access logs on that shared drive show one account used to make those modifications. He said, it wasn't yours. I sat with that for a moment. Outside Daniel's window, King Street was doing its ordinary Tuesday morning things. Buses running, people walking to work, the world continuing as if nothing had been rearranged. There's more, Daniel said. He turned his monitor toward me. The more was this 3 months earlier. Marcus had incorporated a numbered company in Ontario. Nothing illegal about that on its own. But that numbered company had entered into a preliminary agreement with Norbridge Capital, a finder's fee arrangement. If the acquisition of Callaway Millwork closed, Marcus's numbered company would receive a payment equivalent to 4% of the transaction value. 4%. On the number they had discussed at that meeting, 4% was just over $800,000. Paid privately, to a company I had no knowledge of, for a deal that required my signature to close. Marcus stood to collect nearly $1 million for selling me a transaction I had already said I didn't want, and he had done it while quietly making the company look cheaper. So that the price I was being asked to accept, the price that was supposed to make selling worthwhile, was lower than it should have been. He was going to make money twice. Once from the reduced sale price that Norbridge would pay us. Once from the finder's fee that Norbridge would pay him privately for delivering the deal. I was supposed to sign the papers in 4 hours. I called my lawyer from the parking lot. Her name is Gwendolyn, and she has a very particular quality I have always admired in her. She does not react. She listens. She processes. And then she speaks in the measured way of someone who has already sorted what matters from what doesn't. I told her everything. The access logs, the suppressed figures, the numbered company, the finder's fee. She was quiet for a moment. How confident is Daniel in the access log evidence? Very, I said. He pulled the server logs himself. It's time-stamped and tied to Marcus's credentials. All right, she said. Here is what we are going to do. What we were going to do was not cancel the signing. Gwendolyn was very specific about this. We were going to let it proceed. We were going to walk into that room, but I was not going to sign anything. Instead, Gwendolyn was going to be there with documentation. She was going to disclose what we had found. She was going to give Marcus and his representation exactly one opportunity to explain. And if he can't explain, I asked, then we will be taking the position that he has breached his fiduciary duty as a co-owner, violated the terms of the shareholders' agreement, and potentially committed fraud under the Ontario Business Corporations Act, she said, which will expose him to personal liability and will give us grounds to pursue a court order blocking any sale without your explicit consent. And Norbridge. Norbridge is either complicit or they were used. Either way, they have significant exposure. I don't think they will want this to go to litigation. I drove home. I fed my cat. I sat on my couch for 2 hours thinking about the boy who used to drive me to school when I was in grade 9. Who used to call me on my birthday even when we weren't speaking. Who stood beside me at our father's grave and cried in the helpless, ugly way that nobody cries unless the grief is real. Then I got dressed and drove to the lawyer's office. Marcus was already in the boardroom when I arrived, which again was unusual. Renata was with him. She hadn't been at the earlier meetings, and her presence made something settle coldly in my stomach. Fletcher from Norbridge was there with a colleague I hadn't seen before. Papers were arranged in neat piles on the table. Gwendolyn came in behind me and set her briefcase on the table. Marcus looked at her and then at me, and something shifted in his face. Something that was almost, but not quite. A flinch? Before we begin, Gwendolyn said, with the kind of pleasantness that has nothing warm in it. There are some preliminary matters I need to raise on my client's behalf. What happened in the next 40 minutes I will not dramatize. Because the reality of it was not dramatic in the way I expected. It was quiet. That was what surprised me most, how quiet it got when Gwendolyn laid the documentation on the table. The access logs, the financial comparison, what the records showed versus what our actual audited numbers showed. The incorporation documents for the numbered company, the finder's fee agreement, Fletcher from Norbridge looked at the finder's fee agreement for a long time. Then he looked at Marcus. His expression communicated something I didn't need to be a lawyer to read. Renata said, "This is absurd," twice. Then she said, "You need to talk to your lawyer," to Marcus. Which I found interesting. Not, "We need to talk to our lawyer." But you do. Marcus didn't say much. He looked at the papers. He looked at the table. At one point, he looked at me. And I held his gaze. And I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the documents hadn't already said. The signing did not happen that day. What happened in the following weeks I will compress, because the legal mechanics of it are less important than the outcome. Norbridge Capital withdrew from the transaction. Gwendolyn's assessment had been right. They did not want litigation. And the exposure from the finder's fee arrangement, combined with questions about how they had obtained our internal financial information, was enough to make them walk away, quietly and quickly. Marcus's lawyer sent a letter asserting that the altered records were the result of a data synchronization error. Daniel spent 4 days preparing a technical rebuttal that established, with considerable precision, that a synchronization error does not produce 11 separate instances of directional manipulation over 26 months, all favoring the same outcome. Gwendolyn filed that rebuttal with the notice of her client's intention to pursue all available remedies. 2 weeks later, Marcus made an offer. He would sell his 50% stake in Callaway Millwork to me, at a price that reflected the company's actual value, not the suppressed figures, and he would dissolve the numbered company and return whatever he had already received under the finder's fee arrangement, which turned out to be a preliminary payment of $30,000. He would also sign a full release. Gwendolyn advised me to take it. He's exposed on multiple fronts. She said, "A civil suit would cost you 2 to 3 years and significant money, and even if you win every argument, you will have spent those years in litigation instead of running your company. This gets you clean ownership, fair value, and your life back." I asked her what she would do. She said, without hesitation, that she would take it. I took it. The day the transfer completed, I drove to the Brantford facility. It was a Thursday morning in late February. The sky, the particular flat gray that Southern Ontario specializes in between November and April. The parking lot still carrying traces of the last snowfall in the shaded corners. Priya met me at the door with 2 coffees. She'd known something was happening. She's not the kind of person who misses things, but she hadn't asked. And I hadn't offered. And I was grateful for that. We walked the floor together. The saws running, the smell of fresh cut wood, which is one of those smells that is so specific to a particular place and time in your life that it stops being just a smell and becomes something else. I had grown up with that smell on my father's work clothes. Priya said the team had been asking how things were going. I told her things were going well, that the company wasn't going anywhere, that I planned to be there for a long time. She nodded in the way of someone who already knew and just needed to hear it said out loud. I thought about my father, who believed in showing up every morning and doing the job properly, who had built something from a handshake at a Tim Hortons and 31 years of that simple philosophy, who had, at the end of his life, rewritten his will twice and spent more time with his accountant than with his children, and who I now suspect understood. In the way that dying people sometimes understand things, the rest of us need longer to see, that not everyone in the room could be trusted with what he was leaving behind. I think he left it to both of us because he thought equal ownership would force a kind of accountability. I think he believed that structure would hold. I think he was trying his best with information he didn't fully have. I have not spoken to Marcus since the day Gwendolyn laid the papers on the table. He sent a text message the week after the transfer completed. It said, "Only I'm sorry." I know that's not enough. He was right that it wasn't enough. He was also right that it was something. I didn't reply. I'm not sure I ever will. I'm not sure what there is to say to a person who looked at their father's life's work and decided the most important thing to do with their grief was to find a way to profit quietly from someone else's trust. What I know is that 64 people came to work at Callaway Millwork this morning. The contracts are current. The books are clean. Priya is already talking about a potential 5th facility in the Kitchener-Waterloo corridor and the numbers. The real numbers support the conversation. My father used to say that the most important measurement in woodworking is the one you take before you cut. You can always do more work. He said, but you cannot put the wood back. I think about that a lot now. About what gets cut and what can't be restored, and what you build in the space that remains. The space that remains. For me, is a company I intend to run for a very long time. And for the first time in 3 years, it is entirely, simply, and completely mine.